Hi, today we're going to take a look at the Sony A6300. We got this camera just before Photokina 2016 and we actually used it quite a bit in Photokina for all of our videos. Now, a few weeks afterwards, Sony announced the A6500 when we were in the middle of writing this review. So what we decided to do, just like we did with the Nikon D500, is do a pros and cons video. On this camera, we're going to compare some of the notes to the A6500 and what Sony actually changed there. So let's take a look. We recently published our Nikon D500 pros and cons review, which got a nice reaction, and since we worked with the Sony A6300 at around the same time, and just like the D500 it was already extensively reviewed online, we decided to do the same pros and cons video on this camera as well. So let's take a closer look at the camera. The A6300 is very well built. Sony certainly knows how to make a quality product in terms of general build quality and materials. The A6300 has about 10 buttons depending on which one you count and how. Sadly, their location and function is not ideal. You only get 2 dials. We would really like to see a front dial as well. The location of the video recording button isn't convenient. We would prefer it if it was on the top of the camera, and for some reason Sony doesn't let you use the joystick to change the focus point as a default, like you can with Nikon cameras without clicking the center button. The A6300 has a 3-inch 16:9 aspect ratio display, which feels small compared to LCDs of most DSLRs these days. The LCD is not exceptionally good in bright light, and although it can tilt 90 degrees upward, it can't fully tilt downwards like the tilt screen on the D500, for example. A fully articulated screen would have been highly appreciated. Also missing is a touch capability, which Sony did add in the A6500. Sony's menus are notoriously known for being all over the place, and the A6300 isn't different. For example, the video resolution is in a completely different place than the microphone levels, and this is just one tiny example. In Photokina, Sony unveiled the A99 Mark II, which was the first Sony camera to have a revised menu system, and a similar menu system was also implemented in the A6500. The A6300 has one of the best autofocus systems of any mirrorless camera to date. It is fast, responsive, and with the right lens it is also accurate. For stills, the system is very good and not too far behind some of the best DSLR autofocus systems currently on the market. For video, and especially for tracking subjects, the results are good, but we can't help but feel that Sony still has much that it can improve on. The A6500 does bring touch autofocus, which is a very welcome feature missing from the A6300. What we would still really like to see is the ability to fully control the autofocus with zero lag from a mobile device, where we would not be afraid of moving the camera while changing the focus. The A6300 has no built-in image stabilization. This is a big minus, as we discovered in Photokina, especially for shooting video. Even with a monopod, a built-in stabilizer could have been very helpful at times if you're using a non-stabilized lens like the Sigma 30mm that we have used most of the time. The A6500 did add a 5x built-in image stabilization, which is a very welcome addition. The A6300 is a very fast camera with up to 11 frames per second with autofocus in stills mode. You will need a very fast card, of course, if you're going to shoot in RAW or RAW plus JPEG. Do note that while the camera writes to the card, it is almost useless as you can't playback or magnify the images and you just need to wait. The A6500 does improve the buffer considerably and possibly help with this situation a bit as well. The Sony A6300 has a very good image quality in stills, and as you can see from our test images on the screen right now, done with noise reduction off of course, the noise level of the A6300 looks good up to about 6400 ISO. This is quite impressive for an APS-C camera, rivaling the more expensive Nikon D7200 and D500 and the Fujifilm X-T1 and X-T2 cameras. The A6300 can record internal XAVC-S 4K at 30p and 1080p at up to 120 frames per second. The image quality in video is generally very good, but there are some drawbacks. We did notice some moire from time to time, but this isn't really a deal breaker for us. What is much more annoying in our view is the fact that you can't magnify to 100% in video mode, not when you're in the mode itself and surely not when shooting. You can do this when in stills mode where you can actually record video. We have no idea why Sony did this. Another letdown is the preamps on this camera. This isn't really a surprise, this is a problem with most non-video cameras, but after some testing in Photokina we can tell you that we will never intentionally use the sound recorded from our recorder into the camera, and we'll always use the copy saved to the recorder. Even the lowest level of the camera mic input is noisy. Finally, although there is no major crop in 4K mode, it is visible as you can see on the screen right now. The subject of overheating sensor when shooting 4K video with the A6300 has been extensively researched and debated online. We shot mostly in 1080p with the camera, but we did want to see what will happen to our test camera, so we ran a simple indoor test. The camera was set to shoot in 4K at 25p at 100 megabytes per second with the LCD closed using the internal battery. The ambient temperature was around 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit. To our surprise, we were able to shoot the full 30 minutes at the first go. We tested the temperature of the camera afterwards and it was under 40 degrees Celsius or about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. We will mention that the A6500 adds a menu option that circumvents the overheating protection of the camera. We think that this is a pretty lousy solution, but it does work in a pinch and you will get a longer shooting time in a hot ambient weather, and of course a much hotter camera at the risk of a shorter sensor life. The A6300 has 3 physical connectors on the left side, USB, micro HDMI and a microphone jack. What is missing, and is still very much missing on the A6500, is a headphone jack. We typically use this camera with our Tascam DR70D, which has a headphone jack on the side, which we use to monitor the sound as we recorded a video. Just like the Sony A6000 before it and all the current Sony A7 series cameras, the A6300 has only a single slot for SD cards, although thankfully with UHS 2 support. This doesn't allow for a proper backup on the go like many other cameras do, plus it's located on the most inconvenient location in the bottom of the camera next to the battery. This sadly doesn't change with the A6500. We would really like to see Sony making somewhat larger camera with 2 side slots for memory cards. If you're only shooting stills, the A6300 is okay for a day of not too taxing shooting. Around 300 images depending on how much you are going to use the EVF and the rear screen. For video, and especially for 4K video, battery life is just hideous. Even in 1080p, which is what we shot in Photokina, we could not shoot even a third of the day without draining the battery. Luckily, Sony allows for on-the-go charging from USB, which is really a lifesaver, and we came up with a small, simple, though not super attractive looking DIY USB battery holder. This tiny battery was enough to power our A6300 for a full day of intensive video shooting. Sadly, the A6500 has the same NPFW50 battery as the A6300, and the official battery life with the added image stabilization is even lower. Sony should really need to consider a grip with a large lithium-ion battery and a headphone jack for both cameras. So let's try and sum things up. From this list, it seems that we have much more cons than pros for the A6300, which is true. However, this doesn't tell the full story. You need to look at the camera as a whole while considering the price, which at the time of shooting stands at just under $1,000. Pretty affordable in our view for an image quality and 4K video quality that you will be getting, especially at this size. As we have mentioned, the A6500 was announced just a few weeks after we actually started this review, and it does bring a few interesting improvements, including what we think is the most important, in-body 5-axis image stabilization. It also has touchscreen, larger buffer, better menus, slightly improved buttons, and overheating cancellation mode in 4K. There are still many issues which Sony didn't fix with the A6500. The battery life is still short, especially for video. There is still no headphone jack and only a single SD card. It still has quite a bit of rolling shutter and the bottom location still needs improvement. The camera is also about $400 more expensive than the A6300, which leaves the A6300 as a very appealing and affordable option for people who are less video oriented. So these were our notes on the A6300. As always, you can read the full review on lensvid.com, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Next time we're going to take a look at the Sigma 19mm lens for E-mount. See you next time.